How does one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known simply vanish? For over 3,000 years, the Egyptians ruled with power, wealth, and mystery. They built monuments that still baffle scientists today, wrote in a language the world forgot, and saw their kings as gods walking the earth. And yet, when we look for them now, all we find are ruins, relics, and silent stones. Did they collapse under the weight of their own ambition? Were they undone by foreign conquerors? Or was it something far more subtle, something that crept in slowly until Egypt's greatness slipped away without a final battle? The truth is not one single answer. It's a series of falls and rebirths, a story of drought and plenty, of power and corruption, of brilliance and betrayal. And to understand why the Egyptians went extinct, we have to peel back the layers of history and look at the hidden reasons behind their long, slow fade into the sands of time. But before we uncover the fall, we need to see how Egypt became unstoppable in the first place. The rise before the fall. Long before the desert stretched endlessly around the pyramids, Egypt was green. The land that would one day host one of the most powerful empires on earth was once a lush savanna, filled with trees, animals, and flowing water. But as the climate shifted, the people who lived there faced a choice: move or adapt. They chose to adapt. And their survival depended on one lifeline: the Nile. Every year, the river's floods transformed dry soil into fertile farmland, allowing harvests that could feed thousands. Egypt's entire identity grew from this single natural rhythm. Crops meant food, food meant power, and power meant armies, monuments, and kingdoms. But this dependence came with danger. The Nile gave life, but it could also take it away. One bad season could trigger famine. Several years of failed floods could tear the country apart. From the very beginning, Egypt's destiny was chained to the river. This natural advantage made Egypt rich, but it also made them vulnerable. Because when survival hinges on something as unpredictable as the Nile, it doesn't take much to turn a golden age into a desperate fight for existence. And yet, nature wasn't the only force threatening Egypt's future. What came next would prove that the most dangerous enemy often comes from within: the fragility of power. As Egypt flourished, its rulers began to see themselves not just as kings, but as gods. And gods demanded proof of their greatness. That proof came in the form of temples, statues, and tombs so massive they still tower over us thousands of years later. But all that glory had a price. Resources that could have gone to farmers, soldiers, or trade were poured into stone monuments. Land was granted to temples, draining the kingdom's wealth into the hands of priests who grew almost as powerful as the pharaoh himself. Egypt's prosperity was still immense, but beneath the glittering surface, cracks were forming. Then came disaster. Around 2200 BCE, the Nile stopped flooding as it should. Crops failed, famine spread, and the government collapsed. With no central power, governors carved out their own mini-kingdoms. Civil war followed. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids, was over. And yet, Egypt didn't die. The cycle of collapse and rebirth had begun. Each time the empire fell, it eventually rose again, stronger, but also more fractured. The seeds of weakness were always planted in the soil of its success. Because while droughts and famines came and went, the deeper problem was this: Egypt's power was always fragile, balanced between a god-king at the top, ambitious priests and nobles just beneath, and millions of common people who bore the weight of both. When one part of that system faltered, the entire structure began to shake. But even as Egypt struggled to hold itself together, new threats were already arriving, not from the deserts outside, but from the people living inside its borders. Foreign invaders within. As Egypt weakened, outsiders moved in. Among them were the Hyksos, eastern settlers who at first lived peacefully in the Nile Delta. But when famine and chaos spread, they seized power, turning the pharaoh into little more than a figurehead. Instead of destroying Egypt's culture, they copied it. They dressed like Egyptians, worshipped Egyptian gods, and ruled in Egyptian style. But they brought something Egypt had never seen before: new weapons. Horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, stronger metal tools. When the Egyptians finally expelled them, they didn't just reclaim their throne, they inherited a revolution in warfare. Egypt emerged stronger, but also changed forever. And with that, the stage was set for Egypt's greatest era yet, the New Kingdom. But greatness comes with a cost. Golden Age and the cost of glory. With the Hyksos gone, Egypt surged into its most dazzling chapter, the New Kingdom. Pharaohs ruled not just Egypt, but an empire stretching deep into Africa and across the Near East. Trade poured in riches, bronze, cedar wood, ivory, and gold. Temples rose taller than ever, and pharaohs like Hatshepsut and Ramesses II carved their names into history with monuments that still dominate the desert skyline. From the outside, it looked unstoppable. But Egypt's wealth came at a price. Expansion meant endless wars, against Libyans to the west, Hittites to the north, and the mysterious sea peoples crashing onto their shores. Victory was costly, and every triumph stretched Egypt thinner. Inside the kingdom, another struggle was brewing. The high priests, swollen with wealth and land, began to rival the pharaohs themselves. Egypt had faced this power struggle before, and every time it returned, it chipped away at unity. Ironically, Egypt's greatness was the source of its vulnerability. Being the richest nation on earth made it a target for every hungry neighbor. And as pharaohs fought to hold onto their empire abroad, they were losing control at home. The cracks were widening, and soon outsiders would no longer just influence Egypt. They would rule it outright. A nation passed around. Egypt's power had peaked. From here, it became less of a mighty empire and more of a prize to be fought over. First came the Kushites from the south. They admired Egypt so much that, when they seized control, they kept its traditions alive, building pyramids of their own and ruling like pharaohs. For a time, it almost seemed as if Egypt had been reborn. But then the Assyrians stormed in. Unlike the Kushites, they had no interest in honoring Egypt's past. They looted temples, stripped the land of wealth, and left destruction in their wake. Soon after, the Persians took over, ruling Egypt not from the Nile but from far-off capitals in Iran. By now, Egypt was no longer the master of its destiny. It was a treasure chest, opened and emptied by whichever empire could get its hands on it. And then came Alexander the Great. Unlike the Persians, he admired Egypt deeply. He restored temples, founded the shining city of Alexandria, and left behind one of the greatest centers of learning the world would ever know. But admiration didn't mean freedom. Egypt had been absorbed into yet another empire, this time, the Greeks. And still, the final chapter had not yet been written, because Egypt's last stand would come under the reign of a queen whose name the world would never forget: Cleopatra and the Roman chains. If there's one Egyptian ruler everyone knows, it's Cleopatra. But here's the twist: she wasn't Egyptian at all. Cleopatra was Greek, the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line descended from Alexander's generals. By her time, Egypt's culture was already a fusion of Greek and Egyptian traditions. Cleopatra was brilliant, ambitious, and determined to keep Egypt independent. She formed alliances and romances with two of Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. Together, they tried to shield Egypt from Rome's tightening grip. But their gamble failed. In the battle against Octavian, Rome's rising star, Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. Legend says Cleopatra chose not to be paraded through Rome in chains, ending her life on her own terms. With her death, Egypt's independence died too. Rome absorbed Egypt completely. Unlike earlier conquerors, they didn't rule from afar or pretend Egypt was still sovereign. They ruled directly, stripping away traditions, closing temples, and turning the Nile into Rome's grain basket. Egypt, once the richest kingdom in the world, was now just another Roman province. And as centuries passed, something even more devastating than conquest arrived: the slow erasure of identity itself. The erasure of identity. Conquest alone didn't kill ancient Egypt. It was what came after. Under Roman rule, the temples of the gods stood silent. The priests who once rivaled pharaohs lost their power. The old religion, practiced for millennia, was steadily dismantled. Then came Christianity. By the 4th century CE, Rome declared it the official faith, and in Egypt, the shift was swift and brutal. Temples were shuttered, statues of the gods defaced, and the language of the pharaohs, hieroglyphics, was abandoned. Within a generation, few remembered how to read it. Within a few more, it was gone entirely. This was the true extinction of ancient Egypt, not the fall of armies or kings, but the loss of memory. The culture that had defined the Nile for 3,000 years was deliberately erased, replaced by new gods, new rulers, and a new identity. Egypt didn't vanish overnight. It faded piece by piece until even its people no longer remembered the old ways. But why did Egypt, which had always managed to rise again after every collapse, fail to come back this time? Why Egypt really fell? So, why did ancient Egypt truly disappear? The answer isn't simple because Egypt didn't fall once. It fell again and again. Droughts shattered its food supply. Priests and nobles drained its unity. Foreigners seized its throne. And every time, Egypt clawed its way back, rebuilding monuments, reclaiming power, rewriting itself into history. But after centuries of invasions, after being passed from Kushites to Assyrians, from Persians to Greeks, and finally to Rome, the cycle of rebirth broke. By the time Rome imposed its rule, Egypt had been weakened for too long, its independence gone, its gods silenced, its language forgotten. There was nothing left to rise again. And yet, Egypt never really died. Its pyramids still rise from the desert. Its mummies still fascinate us. Its stories still echo in our books, movies, and imaginations. In some ways, the very fact we are still asking what happened, thousands of years later, is proof that Egypt's legacy is stronger than Rome, Persia, or even time itself. Empires are built to look eternal, but they are fragile things. Egypt reminds us that even the greatest can vanish, yet it also proves that some legacies are impossible to erase.